The literary form we're covering this week is the short story. We'll be talking a little bit about the history of the short story, and I'll also give you some advice on analyzing short fiction. So the short story is a natural fit for a world literature course because it's truly a worldwide form. Baldwin and Quinn, 2007, call it vigorously international. There is no singular region that can lay claim on it. One of the reasons it's hard to track to the specific history of this form is that stories were passed around before written history, and they can be considered the precursor of modern short story. The short story's development in different cultures wasn't dependent on technology or distribution hurdles the way that novels development was. So what's included under the short story umbrella today is incredibly diverse. With regards to short stories as published writing, they became popular for readers in the 1800s. That was in part an effect of the Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain and spreading to other areas in Europe as well as in places like the United States and Japan. In those regions of the world, the Industrial Revolution made day-to-day life easier for the average person, creating this unprecedented level of free time for a lot of people. This happened alongside developments in education, like grammar schools, which meant an increase in literacy rates. And that meant, in turn, that more people were interested in reading for pleasure or for independent learning. Printing and distribution practices developed with the Industrial Revolution, and magazines emerged as popular reading. Shorter literary works were perfected for magazines, and readers were really craving shorter pieces. Some people describe the short story as a freer, more democratic form than the novel. And when I say democratic, I mean that in the sense of being less restricted and more available to all. It had fewer gatekeepers. The idea that it's democratic form is particularly thought-provoking because of the short story's connection to postcolonial text, specifically with authors from colonized or formerly colonized groups who chose short story as a medium for making their voices heard or writing back. That's precisely what we're going to be looking at this week as we focus on a collection of short stories from regions impacted by colonization. Our selection spans the 20th century, so they're going to cover the period before, during, and after colonization, when people living under colonial rule are fighting for and regaining independence from colonial powers. One of the commonly recognized effects of these colonial histories is that colonized peoples have their voices silenced. Because colonial powers tend to speak for them, telling them who they are, how they are, and what they need, they can become separated from their identities. That's what it means to be othered. Well, to reassert themselves as people with opinions, cultures, histories, and so on, these othered groups produce their own literature to reflect their own experiences and perspectives. This requires overcoming a host of challenges, some of which were challenges by design, right down to the practical economics of publishing. It takes access to a broad readership to make your voice heard. It takes a means of distribution to make your voice heard. It takes money to make your voice heard. It also takes an unrelenting belief that you have something important to say. Another factor in people making their voices heard is that some cultures that were colonized had strong oral traditions, whereas the West tended to have privileged written traditions. So while there is a long and vibrant storytelling traditions in some of these cultures, they don't become as visible to the broader world until they're published and distributed as a written literature, which is generally around the mid-20th century. This is a case for all sorts of cultures, from the diverse descendants of enslaved peoples in the Caribbean to the Maori people in New Zealand, and that's a lot of what you can expect to see this week. Now, let's get to some of the overall advice for analyzing short stories. This will include suggestions and targeted questions to help you get at the literature. The upside here is that short stories give us less ground to cover in terms of applying analysis, but that makes it all the more crucial to go below the surface. First of all, read and reread. Doing a bunch of rereads isn't always feasible with some of the longer works of fiction, depending on how many other things you're juggling, but it really is feasible with short stories. It's a good idea to read a short story at least 2 or 3 times before you decide what the general message is you're seeing. Now for some central questions, starting with what's the setting? This includes a country, a city, neighborhood, year, season, time of day, building, specific room, anything that can fall into the categories of where and when. For example, the story Guests of a Nation by Frank O'Connor takes place in an Irish prisoner camp. It's an Irish prisoner war camp in the 1910s, and that probably means something. The story 123 Little Indians by Hugh Gardner largely takes place in a mid-20th century trailer camp for tourists in Ontario, and that probably means something too. The setting also includes specific culture and cultural moments from which the story emerges. For example, in the O'Connor story, it comes out of a very long and bloody conflict between England and Ireland, derived from England's colonization of Ireland, something that really started in the 12th century. O'Connor's writing about an Irish rebellion, but he was writing and publishing about a decade after Southern Ireland gained its independence from Great Britain. So Ireland had achieved some measure of success in its fight against England, but the Irish Republican Army was still quite active. O'Connor was himself a former IRA member, so you know he's got some opinions about how things are going. It would also be important to have some sense of that in order to pick apart potential meaning in the story. Now, to be clear, you're not expected to know this kind of background in literature. It does take a little research, which is totally encouraged. Just remember to cite if you're bringing in outside sources on the, in your works, which you don't have to do. You don't have to do the outside research. If there's anything you're not clear on with citations, just please ask. Another important question to ask is, of course, who is narrating and what is the narrator's perspective and tone and why? If the story is from the perspective of a child, then perhaps the author wants to overlay a kind of innocence and blamelessness that we associate with children. Maybe the author wants to disarm the audience by using a child's voice. If the story is told completely through the entries of a logbook, as is the case with V.S. Naipaul's short story, The Night Watchman's Occurrence Book, maybe the author wants the audience to reflect on how the characters' reactions develop over time and on how the characters struggle to communicate through writing logbook entries. Getting back to narrative approaches, perhaps the story uses a specific dialect in its narration or in its dialogue. This could mean that the author really wants the audience to hear the language and have a stronger sense of place by appreciating the different linguistic norms as an expression of the culture. Maybe the author wants to bring in the kind of race and class connotations that mark a given dialect or accent in a given time or place. There's plenty of dialect presented throughout our selections, so this is definitely something you need to think about. What is the central conflict? Sometimes the conflict is straightforward, as in the story School Picnic by A.P. Glaskell. Sometimes the conflict is more subtle, as it is in A Hanging by George Orwell. Regardless, having an idea of a story's central tension will allow you to reflect on whether that tension is resolved or not by the end of the story. If the conflict is resolved, what is the audience meant to learn from it? If the conflict isn't resolved, what is the audience meant to learn from that sort of open-endedness ending? Diction also is enormously important. What stands out to you in the specific word choices? Now, let's talk about diction, which as a term means word choice. No single word ends up in a short story by accident. The wording is meticulously considered by the author. With short stories specifically, there's a compactness and an economy of language that you should be thinking about twice, and it should make you ask why the author would use that specific word or phrase. So, as an example, think about all the synonyms for the word walk, and think about how the meaning for the sentence is slightly different depending on a single word. He walked out of the room. He sauntered out of the room. He lumbered out of the room. He marched out of the room. He waddled out of the room. He trudged out of the room. There's a world of difference just in changing one word. Be attentive to the specific wording so that you can get a sense of the meaning behind the diction. With applying postcolonial analysis, here are a few questions to keep in mind. To what extent is this an example of writing back to the colonial power? Where and how do you see people telling their own stories? And what postcolonial themes emerge, and what messages do we get from those themes? And that is a wrap on our postcolonial short story video, and a special thank you as always to Ms. Karen Kaiser.